hold the microphone.
Oh, thank you. There you go.
There you go.
Is that okay? Thank you. Hey everybody, my name's Che Johnson, or Ali Babu Che Johnson. Yes, my parents gave me that name. I'm a clinical psychotherapist, and I actually had, the first work that I've ever had published is about how infant genital mutilation is an actual sexual trauma, and I used the DSM-5 to prove it. And I also showed that it's also, it's a little more than that. It's a way of stamping gender. It's a way of saying this is what a boy is supposed to look like, and in countries where they're circumcising girls, this is what a girl is supposed to look like. So in my practice, I have lots and lots of different kinds of clients and couples and families and things like that. But one of the things is I use my identity. My mom's Jewish, my dad's black, I'm gay, so I kind of won the lottery. So I actually use my identity in therapy because a lot of my clients have all these different identities that are coming together and that kind of thing. So my experience, my personal experience with intactivism is I'm one of the lucky ones. My father was born on a farm. He wasn't circumcised. And my mother's born Orthodox Jewish father, when it was time to give birth, she's asking around. Our Jewish pediatrician says, you don't really need to do it. The obstetrician was like, oh no, it's gotta happen, because it's a whole thing. And then my grandfather was like, this is barbaric, don't do this, which is really interesting. And I think it's important because the experience that I have as a Jewish person is that there's a lot of us who are against circumcision and think it's barbaric. So that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. So anyways, let's take a look at this. I'm going to start here with 3 assumptions because I think we're all assuming these things. And the first thing is that, this is an epidemic, right? This is absolutely an epidemic. Forced genital mutilation, and you said secular circumcision. Did you just come up with that? Because that was awesome.
Oh, no,
it's kind of alliterative in a way. Secular circumcision. It just really works. So I think I might start saying that. I was like, wait, that's great. Write that down. So yeah, and then the other thing is that there's a lot of us disagree about a lot of things, but we're all here and we all agree about this, right? And then the third thing is that when we bring people together, we can really, really change this. So coalition building is going to end this. And I just want to kind of, talk about these. So this first assumption here, right, is I kind of looked at the definition of an epidemic, right? And in the third part, you'll see here, characterized by widespread growth. It says, and they use it in the example, the practice had reached epidemic proportions, right? Well, the practice of infant genital mutilation has reached epidemic proportions, right? It's a really, really, big thing. The national rate, it changes, but it's about 60% from our last data that we still don't have.
15 years ago.
Exactly, that's the problem. And when I was the work that I was working, that I published, we were getting, it was in 2019, I was still getting old numbers. And that was 6 years ago, they were 10 years old, so it's about 15. But it's higher in the West and the Northeast, and in the West, it's actually lower, right? And this is one of the places where it's the lowest. So I'm very curious about that, like why is it low and that kind of thing here, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But I want to go to the next question here, right? These are the people in the groups who disagree on a lot of issues, but we're all agreeing that forced genital mutilation needs to be curtailed. And I think it's interesting to take a look at this insane group. So I put in lactivist because I'm a lactivist. My mother was a founding member of La Leche League. So you guys, and those who know what that is, right? So a lot of lactivists who are pro breastfeeders, right? They want to keep they want to keep everything natural, I guess you could say, right? And then you've got people who are anti-Semitic, white nationalists, right? A lot of them are actually using anti-circumcision as a cudgel to kind of bash Jews and Muslims, right? Assuming that all Jews are pro-circumcision, The rhetoric also attacks Islam in general. It's Islamophobia, and it's a very strange thing because you'll get people who are just against circumcision. They may not even be against female circumcision. They may be just against male circumcision because it's something that Jews do, and they're against Jews. So it's just something you have here, right? And you have there's Christians, and they know, if you look at the Old Testament, the circumcision, the New Testament is very clear. It's an old covenant. It's not needed. Catholics didn't circumcise as a practice in the United States for many years. So you have Christians. You have pro-lifers, right? And the whole idea is that they're seeing both abortion and circumcision as unnatural, right? You've got pro-choice people who are seeing bodily autonomy as the issue. So they want there to be bodily autonomy for everyone, right? You've got anti-vaxxers who see both infant genital mutilation and vaccination as violations of the child's bodily integrity, right? Then you've got pro-vaxxers who are saying they see scientific data showing that the health and efficacy of intact people throughout the history of the world. That's evidence that genital cutting is harmful, right? We have groups like Bloodstained Men, who really are only street protesting intactivists, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them because I think they have a very special place in the way that this movement works. Can be very important. We have the men's movement, right? And they're seeing circumcision as kind of like a primary attack on men's well-being, and maybe some of the big reasons why men are having all kinds of problems. And some of the work that I've done about it actually being the first trauma and the first after birth, and then the first sexual trauma that a boy experiences. So, and then we have LGBTQIA identities, right? And we're seeing, I'm saying we because I'm queer, right? We're seeing bodily autonomy as central to the human rights that respect gender and sexual identity and expression, right? And I'm gonna, part of that LGBTQIA is the I, and I really want to talk about the I for a minute, and the intersex activists, because people who are assigned people who are assigned intersex at birth, and they have less binary genitalia, right? They may have features of both of what we consider the binary genitalia.
I'm gonna do this so much better.
They are more vulnerable to infant genital mutilation than even infant boys in this country and infant girls, right? Now, this may seem really weird, but 1 in 9 babies that are initially assigned female at birth in this country are at risk for being mutilated. And the reason why is because if some of those babies, if their clitoris is deemed too big or too long, right, they can no longer be assigned, they're no longer being assigned female, right? And then once they're assigned intersex, they move into a different category, even in states where genital mutilation against female babies is illegal. They move into a new category, now they're intersex, and they're slated for clitoral mutilation. So this is, it's kind of we're gonna have some people in this movement who really are only thinking about male circumcision. That's all they're really interested in, is stopping male circumcision. And they actually might think that clitoral mutilation is okay because they may have a very strong binary view of gender, and they're like, well, if the doctor says that the kid's clitoris is too long, then it has to be shortened, then, I don't know, but these are these things that I think we need to be talking about and having conversations about, right? So it's a big world out there, and one of the things we all agree on is general autonomy for babies. So,
Yeah.
So I decided to take a look at how do we build coalition, right? And I started to look at some examples. When you have this is a big umbrella, big circus tent, right? How do you build coalition? So I started to look at some examples from history. And so I looked at Fred Hampton. So Fred Hampton was this teenager who kind of became radicalized and joined the Black Panther movement. And then he started to look around and say, there's a lot of white people who agree with me. There's a lot of Chinese people who agree with me. A lot of Latinos who agree with me. There's a lot of people who agree with the same things the Black Panthers are doing, but we're missing out because we're not bringing them in together. So he first, he first began to build coalition with the Young Patriots, and the Young Patriots are I'll show you the here's all the organizations he built coalition with. So you've got a Confederate flag there. This guy walks into a place where the Young Patriots are and says, "Hey, we're all getting screwed by the man. Let's work together. Let's work against poverty. Let's work against we really do have the same goals in mind." Now, when you look at all these different groups, there's two different Latino groups, Puerto Rican and Chicano groups. There's an Asian American group, right? The Red Guard Party. There's student groups here, Rising Up, Angry. There's all kinds of different groups here, and they all came together as a coalition. And Freddie Hampton is he was a very, very special being. There's a movie called Judas and the Black Messiah, which is all about this extraordinary person and all the things that he was able to do. So I'm looking here and I'm going, wow, this is pretty amazing that he's able to do this, right? One of the things that he did was he stopped talking about white men as the problem and started talking about capitalism as the problem. So the Rainbow Coalition changed their language, right? They did a lot. They did a lot to feed children. They did a lot community organizing. They changed the name of their opponent from the white man to the capitalists because they started to see that everybody in these groups had this in common, right? Now, I know this is kind of controversial, but and by the way, he was deemed one of the most dangerous people at the age of 21. His house was just barraged with bullets, and he covered his child's body and saved his child, but died at the age of 21. If you think about a 21-year-old who's building a gigantic coalition, it's kind of an amazing thing, right? But he saw that people had things in common. So he understood that was what was important. So this Rainbow Coalition was pretty robust, and it did thrive even after Fred Hampton died, but there is something that kind of destroyed it, and I want to talk about that because we can look at the mistakes that happened with the Rainbow Coalition and see that as we're building coalition with all these different ideas, that we also have to be careful of different things. So the COINTELPRO, which is a counterintelligence program, right? It's developed by the CIA and the FBI, and the whole idea was you get CIA and FBI agents to go into these organizations, right? And then they would start saying, we need to carry guns and we need to be shooting people, and they start advocating for these violent solutions. And people are like, well, we're feeding kids, we're trying to, stop police brutality, and they're no, we're not doing enough, and kind of guilting people and manipulating people. And the next thing you know, some people get caught up in that, and then you have the organization goes from being peaceful to becoming violent. And then when it becomes violent, it becomes a target. It becomes a legitimate target for the very organizations that fomented that, right? And so the Rainbow Coalition was a big tent organization. So we talk about big tent versus poison pill, right? And it's a big tent organization, and so everybody was just allowed in, including these COINTELPRO agents, right, who came in. And so when that happened, they didn't have any kind of way to lift police, for lack of a better word, these ideas about violence, right? And so they didn't have what's called a poison pill, right? They didn't have an antidote for this. They didn't have a way to handle this, a defensive strategy. So I took a look and I started to compare, okay, what can we do that's different to make sure that this doesn't happen, right? And so if you look at the attack of this movement, right? we have a lot of different voices out there. I don't think we have violent voices. There are some cases, I've been doing some research about it. There are some instances where people who are circumcisers or who advocate for circumcision have gotten violent threats, right? It does happen. And there is a great deal of violence against Jews and Muslims, and violent threats against Jews and Muslims who are advocating for cutting, right? So that is happening, and I think it's important. And what I want to say is that just looking at what happened with COINTELPRO and the Rainbow Coalition, it's not in our best interest to have in our organization these violent ideologies, right? I don't think it will really work. We may have to limit entry to that because the association won't be great for us. I mean, as Eric said, this is a mainstream organization. We're doing mainstream work here. So if we do have violent tendencies, they may not be able to work functionally in coalition, right? It just may not be something that really helps functionally, right? So we may have to have strategies to prevent that, right? But I actually want to talk about something that I think is even more dangerous than COINTELPRO in 2024, and something that may even be more dizzying than having violent aspects of different parts of this coalition, and that's misinformation and disinformation, right? We've got AI that is accelerating images, making things look like legitimate news. Mainstream media is no longer even mainstream, right? Most people are getting their news from, YouTube. I mean, I have a subscription to the New York Times. I haven't even read it since, for 2 months, most of the time I get my news from, media, social media, or I'll be on Google and there's a bunch of headlines on Google, right? Yeah. So we're definitely not getting news the same way that we used to. We are highly susceptible to misinformation, disinformation. I have passed on misinformation and been misinformed before. When I saw something that just looked legit, but it hit me emotionally, and I passed it on. So this is something that, and I think it's actually more dangerous. I think it's actually a greater threat to our coalition building than some agent coming in. And I mean, that's not how it works now. The agent is the disinformation. The agent is the misinformation. So I think that that's something we have to kind of look for, right? So how do we build coalition with so much of this mishigas going on, if I can use that word, right? Okay. Well, one of the ways we can do this is we change the overstory. And I didn't even know what an overstory was until I looked at this book by Malcolm Gladwell called Revenge of the Tipping Point. About 25 years ago, Malcolm Gladwell wrote this. He's a journalist. He wrote The Tipping Point. Now he has all these awesome podcasts. They're incredible. There's a whole podcast cottage industry. And the Tipping Point was all about what makes people change their minds. What's that number where something happens and then people pop and they change their minds? And what he discovered, and just by researching, is that the magic ratio is like about 1/4 to 1/3. So when 1/4 of the people believe something, you start getting motion moving toward that in that direction. And when 1/3 hits, it's like a watershed. And so he wrote Revenge of the Tipping Point late last year as kind of like a way of looking at it. So here's some of the things that he talks about in it. And he talks about how, I mean, this is already dated, but he's studying how tipping points work and how they have worked historically. And so he looked at television, right? And there's a TV expert who looked at the different, they basically canvassed all these different people, all these different groups, right? And found out that, as we expected, liberals, moderates, conservatives, they greatly disagree on lots of issues. But when those same people were only members of the groups who watched a lot of TV, everything changed, right? They mostly agreed on kind of everything. And one example of this is in the book this is very strange for me because I was born in 1970, so it's hard for me to imagine this, but people who are older may be able to imagine that there was a time when people didn't talk about the Holocaust. It was just really a taboo thing. Like, it was a shameful thing. Jews didn't want to talk about it. We didn't want to appear to be weak. And then around 1978, 79, it started changing and people started to talk about it. And they started to, there was a mini-series that came out called The Holocaust. The word Holocaust had not been used in popular culture until this came out. And then after that, all of a sudden there was a big sea change in this understanding about the Holocaust from this TV show. In the 70s, for those who don't get this, there were 3 networks, and a fifth of the audience is watching one of those stations. So you have TV was greatly influencing what the overstory is. And if you want to understand what an overstory is, the overstory literally means the top story of a canopy, right? Like in a rainforest. So that very top story in the rainforest is the one that lets in the light or blocks the light. It's the part of this whole tiered structure that influences the way that everybody on the ground and all the organisms are going to go. That's the overstory. So in science, but the overstory for us in culture is when we all kind of espouse and believe something, and even though we're not really thinking about it because we're kind of on the ground doing our lives, right? The overstory is really influencing how things are. So TV media was really that top canopy, right? That creates the overstory. It also reflects the overstory, right? Because a lot of times television will kind of show us something that everybody's thinking, or reflect what everybody's thinking, and sometimes it really drives culture and brings in new ideas that really change the way we think. So here's an example of how media can drive culture or reflect culture, right? So there's a TV movie that got 3 Emmy nominations called Doing Time on Maple Drive. What the heck does this have to do with intactivism, right? Well, I'm using this as an example just as I used Rainbow Coalition as an example of coalition building. This is an example of how media reflects an overstory, right? Came out in 1992, and a scholar, Bonnie Dow is a scholar, she does all this stuff in media and marginalized communities, and she showed that there were 3 rules. This TV movie reflected 3 rules about gays and popular culture, right? And the so-called main character is he's like this golden boy, and with the Yale on the front, and he's like, the perfect son and all that, but he's actually gay as a secret. And the whole movie is about how everybody is so shocked and horrified that he's gay, right? It's not even about him. It's about all the straight people who are they can't handle his horrible life, right? But this was 1992, and this was reflecting, it was reflecting what the overstory was, right? And then comes along the big game changer, Will and Grace. So Will and Grace has two kind of seasons, right? There's the main one is 1998 to 2006. That's the main one, and then it kind of came back in 2017 for like 3 seasons, right? Okay. And this was a really different idea because the idea behind Will and Grace is actually a love story that never gets consummated. So there's always this sexual tension between Will and Grace. Like, they're not going to get together, but it feels like they might. And even the writers said that they wanted people to believe that he was going to somehow become straight, even though it wasn't going to happen in the first season, right? So what they were really doing is they were subverting these rules, right? So you got gay people are never the center, and Will and Grace, obviously they're the center, right? Or that the gay person's sexuality is the only defining factor about their lives, right? But Will and Grace, he's got all this stuff going on, Jack's got all this stuff going on, It's not a problem to be solved, it's just a thing, right? And then the third rule is that gay characters are seen in isolation, they have these horrible lives, whatever. But here in Will and Grace, it's just kind of there that gay people are hanging out with straight people, hanging out with gay people, hanging out doing all kinds of things, right? So we get the overstory about what it is to be gay gets subverted. And again, what does this have to do with what we're doing here? Well, these changes in the overstory really do change policy, right? They really do make a difference. Maine voters, the big reason why Maine voted, they were canvassed. Like they saw this possibility in Maine of getting marriage equality, right? And they kept trying and trying. And in 2009 they tried, and they tried a bunch of times. But from 2009 to 2012, Maine voters changed their minds. And the overwhelming reason why they changed their minds was television, right? Now, I know it's so weird because our lives are moving so quickly now. It's actually difficult to imagine that in 2012, TV was actually still important. I mean, now everybody's on their devices, that's the TV canopy, right? But at the time, that's how the overstory was being reflected, and that's how the overstory could be subverted, and that's how the overstory could be changed, right? And so Rick Santorum, who was a senator, was a huge, massive anti-gay senator, right? I mean, this guy was like, I could tell you stories. But he had to admit, and I'm just going to read this, it's fascinating. I was in politics for 16 years, and I realized something particularly on the moral and cultural issues, right? It's that politics does not shape those issues. Popular culture shapes those issues, particularly the issue of gay marriage. When it came to the issue of gay marriage and changing the definition of marriage, there was no change, none, zero, for 30 years. And then a television show came on the air called Will and Grace, right? So the whole idea is that I'm sure that this gentleman here can attest to it, that in the 90s when you asked, is marriage equality going to happen? Maybe in 40 years? Maybe? It just doesn't look great, People are dying of AIDS, it's a really intense time. I don't think it's going to happen. But the overstory was actually changing. And this is really important. The overstory was changing, and it was getting to that tipping point where 25% to 33.3% of Americans were starting to see a different overstory about gay people. And in the 90s, we probably were at like 21%, but we didn't know because we hadn't reached that tipping point where things change. And then all of a sudden, it's just accelerated very quickly because the overstory changed. And that's one of the things that can happen as we're building coalition. We're building that, we're pushing ourselves toward that tipping point where we can have a real change, right? We may be at 24% right now, where 24% of Americans think that keeping a child intact is the right way to go. We don't even know yet. But once it hits that 25, you'll feel the acceleration. Once it hits that 33%, it's really going to change, right? We become normal people. Even if you disagree with us, it's like, okay, well, you're here, right? Okay. So gay marriage tipped. What's going to make general autonomy tip? Yes, unintended. Right?
I get it.
Right? What do we do? How do we get this coalition going so that even if there are voices that are fringy, right, that we still are able to make a change in the overstory, that we're able to subvert it. One of the things about Will and Grace is it wasn't really revolutionary. It was kind of a regular sitcom, right? But you also had all this activism going on at the same time. So I want to, first, before we even answer that question, I just want to say that the top canopy is no longer TV, as I said, right? We've got multiple influences across fractured media outlets, right? Obviously, it's a very different world right now. And so I actually think that just challenging the status quo in every way we can, Eric has a YouTube channel. He does a live stream like once a week, right?
We'll get there. We're doing it every day, and then
Right.
we built the tickets, and I was like, okay, I'm
Yeah.
exhausted.
Yeah.
But we'll do it once a week, yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, the whole idea is that you know we're block. It becomes something that's just normal. It's normal to not cut your kids. And okay, we were on an amazing call, and I don't know. You may be here, and I'm so sorry, but he said people are still not able to talk about this. Circumcision breaks their brains. Do you know who that was? We were on a call. So and I love that phrase because it's like I haven't been born in 1970. It was still a very taboo thing to talk about being gay. Very, very taboo, right? It was still breaking people's brains in the 70s and 80s. And we're still in this taboo space. We're talking about cutting infants' genitals breaks people's brains. They just don't want to talk about it. It's just not quite there, right? And so we have to find ways to subvert these overstories and these rules, and just kind of and just show that, hey, no, actually it's completely fine. It's just, you know, it's fine to talk about this. It's fine to whatever. And so I think that we actually just need to use all of these media outlets. We need to, you know, do everything we can. It's not going to be about some TV show that has, you know, an intactivist in it. It's going to be that and a lot of other things, right? So back to Bloodstained Men. So Eric and I talk about this a lot. This 1-2 punch approach, right? And so in the '60s, you had this very militant, vocal Malcolm X, who actually, at the end of his life, really changed and became very inclusive. I think that's why he was so dangerous then, because he was so divisive previously. And he went to Mecca, he had this revelation, and he became very inclusive. But you definitely had one voice that was very aggressive, very militant, and then you had Martin Luther King, who was like, hey, let's just do nonviolence, and we just need to show up. We just need to show that we're human beings, and this will change. Even if people don't see us as human beings, we know we're human beings, let's just show up. And, you know, Malcolm X was like, screw that, let's just, you know. So there's something about this 1-2 punch. There's something about this approach where you gotta find where you fit in. If you're Brother K, go out there and make the doctors feel uncomfortable, right? But maybe you're not. Maybe that's not how you do it. We've got to find the different ways. Everybody's going to kind of help in this. And it's really about the overstory, because we've got so many mini stories coming at us that we've got to really, really secure that overstory. So yeah, it's kind of working, you know, in different ways to do different things. And I think that if we work together, we can change the way that forced genital cutting is talked about and seen, and you know, we'll be able to help all babies and of all genders remain intact. Thank you.